Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. My name is Patrick Millikin, and it is a real treat and an honor to have Tammy Greenwood, aka T. Greenwood, which we'll get into that, who's here talking about her terrific new book, Keeping Lucy, which is, wow, we were talking a little bit before. There's so much to discuss with this book, and can you tell us basically what inspired you to write this book and set it in this particular moment in time?
So this is a book about a woman who gives birth to a child that is quickly whisked away from her when it's discovered that she has Down syndrome, and very much controlled by her husband and her father-in-law. And this is not a decision that she makes on her own. And but she's discouraged from visiting the child. And for 2 years she complies. She's very sort of stunned into submission, I guess, and does exactly what her husband says. And then she reads an expose. Her best friend shows her a newspaper expose that runs for a week long with a new article every day in the local paper, which reveals the institution where this baby has been kept to be just a hell on earth for its residents, its patients. And so at that moment she knows she has to go either confirm or see that everything's okay at the school, or that it's not okay, and do something about it. And so her best friend and she go and discover that it's exactly as they've said. And then the rest of the book is basically about her getting this child out of there, fighting against her husband, her father-in-law, the law.
Right.
The second half I've been calling my Thelma and Louise if they had kids.
Right.
But
Right.
they become fugitives basically on the run. And it was inspired because I've always had a fascination for these institutions. And I remember we were talking about the Willowbrook School, which is in Staten Island, and Geraldo Rivera did expose on that. It sort of was the thing that made him famous. I think he got a key and went in with cameras at night to this horrible place in Staten Island.
This is before Jimmy Hoffa, right?
Yeah. And so I've been fascinated by it, so I always compare, when I'm writing a book, it's like my brain is this junk drawer with all these things inside floating around, and they're different curiosities or obsessions or places I've been or characters I want to write about. And so that was the one sort of big object that I pulled out, and I knew I wanted to write about a place like this. But then at the same time, I knew I wanted to write about a woman who was really finding her voice and figuring out who she was at a time when women were becoming empowered. She's not a woman who's at the forefront of the women's movement, though. She's very much under her husband's thumb. She's a housewife. She has another child when Lucy is born, Peyton, named after Peyton Place. And so I had two different agendas with this book. I really wanted to explore what it was like for people with disabilities, special needs children at this time. And I also wanted to explore what it meant to be a woman at this time. And Ginny and my mom are basically the same age. My mom's a little younger than Ginny is, but I've grown up hearing the stories about her coming of age at that time, and so it's a time period that I feel very close to. And I picked Massachusetts because I actually had visions early on of I wanted them to meet on the Amherst College campus, and so it was just serendipity that the Belchertown State School for the feeble-minded, which is a real place, and that's what the school is based on, is right there, right near Amherst. So it was kind of just this wonderful, all the little pieces in the junk drawer kind of fit together, and then I wrote the story.
Right. Well, it's interesting. So the book kind of opens in 1969, and can you kind of walk us through this? Ginny is obviously very pregnant and has no idea they don't know if it's going to be a boy or a girl. You know, she hopes it's a girl. And they get to the hospital and she gives birth, and right away this baby is just whisked away from her. And the doctors, you know, they stick her and inject her with various, you know, tranquilizers and things. And when she sees her baby daughter once, you know, and has this, I mean, obviously that's a very primal connection. And you really, reading the book, you really get a feel for that. You know, obviously, you know, as a male, I got a real, it was a real eye opener. You know, because you see this primal bond, and at that time, one of the things that really struck me as I was reading the book was that, you know, males are in charge of a woman's body. You know, throughout the course of the whole book, and everybody here's like, yeah. You just noticed that, buddy? But at this moment in history, it's really striking.
Yes.
You know, she has no real control. And the horror even of, you know, having her daughter just be gone. And also I wanted to ask you to process in your research the process by which that happened. In the sense that somebody, her husband, had to, I guess, sign over their rights to the child.
Custodial rights.
And after that, it's like, this child is no longer theirs and they have no rights.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I had started drafting the book, and I knew, I sort of knew my first line, and I knew I wanted it to open with the birth of this baby, and for things to go horribly wrong. You know, it actually opens at her baby shower when she's, and her water breaks during her baby shower, and then she gets taken to the hospital, and they're very excited, and there's a blood moon that night, and there actually is a superstition that if you look at a blood moon when you're pregnant, your baby will be born deformed. And so the nurse is very awful and accusatory to her when the baby is born. But I, you know, I drew on my own experience. I have 2 children, so I drew on my own experience, but, you know, it was a very different birth experience for me than for Ginny, because, you know, the baby immediately put on your chest to, you know, but my second daughter was 5 weeks early, and she was whisked away. So, and I knew, you know, especially having had a child once, that feeling of not having the immediate connection, and there was no sound, and the NICU nurses were all, you know, sort of huddled around her, and it really stuck with me. I mean, she was fine, everything was good, but, you know, they were at the ready in case there was anything wrong with her lungs or anything, because she was so little. And so I really kind of went back to that place, and then also my mom's stories of my birth in a rural hospital where she was given ether, because I don't know why on earth you were given ether too. Yeah, probably the same doctor. I bet it was the same doctor that delivered me and Janet.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I probably was. Same small town. And what was your other question?
Well, it was really just about the process by which, when you were researching these kind of cases where the children were taken away and put in these institutions, they really had no rights, really.
Well, a lot, because it was a state hospital. What I learned about Belchertown anyway was that in order to get your child the resources of being there, you know, in order to admit them, they had to often give up their custodial rights, which was something that I learned in researching Benjamin Ricci, who was the parent who sort of spearheaded the class action lawsuit that was filed against the school. And in this book, the parents do the same after this expose, and there was an actual expose in the 1971 in the paper. I think it was the Lowell newspaper in Western Mass, and so in reading he wrote a big book called Crimes Against Humanity, and he talked about giving up the custodial rights to his child in order to give him this opportunity, and then just having that just be this like horrific thing. And of course it's a beautiful thing as a novelist to be like, oh my gosh, you know, how do you make it incredibly hard for your and the stakes are so high when she goes to see Lucy and check her out of the hospital, which they would allow parents to do, even though they had relinquished their custodial rights. They would still allow them for visits, and and things. And I took some license liberties too, with the
Sure.
with the story. But I wanted there to be a lot of complications, and that was the first one. It was very easy. It was like, well, it doesn't get much more complicated than that, because you go from being a concerned parent to being a criminal to, for taking a child out and not returning the child becomes kidnapping when when the child no longer belongs to you.
Right. And can you talk a little bit about just the way in which, what am I trying to say? The way in which society, and certainly the medical profession, actually viewed these kids at the time. You get the sense that, this particular institution, although it was horrific, perhaps wasn't completely unique, in the sense that, in the book, they're using words like, oh, this kid's a mongoloid, is never going to be as smart as a dog, really horrible language to describe these kids, and in a way, sort of dehumanizing them at the very beginning, which kind of, you can start to understand how this sort of, if these kids are less than human, then why expend resources to really care for them? What did you uncover during the course of your research?
It's heartbreaking, and the warehousing of human beings. That's really what it was. It was just the most vulnerable citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're just put away and out of sight, out of mind, and that's sort of what happens in Ginny's situation. Is her husband is an attorney, and he has aspirations to be a DA and possibly go into politics eventually, and his father-in-law, and he worked at the same firm, and it's a liability to his career, and she's really not seen as human at all. But the medical community, the documentary that I watched about Belchertown was so incredibly disturbing, and it wasn't just the footage of the hospital. That was horrifying, but the commentator, talking about these patients and these children and these young adults, and the language that was used, and granted it was 1972, 1971, I can't remember when the documentary was made, but it was just a whole different mindset, completely different mindset about the value of these human lives, it was really, it's thankfully we've come a long way, and I think there's probably farther to go, but it's amazing to me that it's been within my lifetime, that children like this, who are suffering from anything from, the scary thing is, what I learned is that kids, were institutionalized for Down syndrome. They were institutionalized for cerebral palsy was a huge one. Various mental and physical, but also being deaf, being blind. Just things that you would never even dream of separating a child from their family for. It's really, really hard.
Well, there's a point in the book where where actually the Lucy gets to see a real doctor finally, a couple of them at the end, towards the end of the book. I'm not going to spoil anything, but it's not a spoiler to say that the doctor says, yes, these places are going about it exactly the wrong way, because these children with Down syndrome, for instance, what they need the most is that connection and that closeness and extra attention, to actually develop. And Lucy, we see little bits and pieces. She doesn't stick to that stereotype. She's yes, she has this disability, but she has a lot of potential, and a lot more potential than they give her credit for.
Right. And when I wanted to, Down syndrome children can be, very severely affected and very highly functioning. And so I really wanted to think, I knew that she would be traumatized and having spent her first 2 years of development in an institution, even the most highly functioning and highly capable and highest potential child would be damaged.
Yeah.
And so I really had to think about how to present her in a way that was realistic, but also hopeful. I also didn't want I didn't want the reader to feel like the damage had been done, lost cause, sort of thing. And I have a student who is writing a book that's set in part in an orphanage, and she found this term, which I'd never heard, called skin hunger. It's basically when babies aren't touched. I mean, it's like a physical.
It's a good title.
That's what I told her. I said this would be amazing. Skin hunger.
Or a good rock band name.
Yeah.
Skin Hunger Live. That's fascinating. Yeah, just that kind of neglect.
The lack of
physical
touch.
Yeah. Let's talk a little. The characters, we were discussing this a little bit. I really appreciate how they don't do exactly what you think they're going to do. They don't respond in the way you think they're going to respond. And you have, this couple, Ab for Abbott Jr., and he meets Ginny in you kind of go back and forth in time a little bit, and you show how their relationship started in the mid-60s, right? Really 63, and she really seems to be, I think they meet on campus, she's the librarian, and
at an all-men's college.
At an all-men's, right.
Yeah. So Amherst used to be all-men's.
Detail, yes.
Yeah.
And he invites her, he has these tickets to go see JFK speak at this dedication ceremony, right?
For the Robert Frost Library.
Yeah, Robert Frost. And, she's from a different socioeconomic class than he is, I guess you'd say. And I like how you describe, he takes her, there's a very, pivotal scene, I thought, in the book, where he takes his new girlfriend home to the family estate, meets the parents, and what happens? Can you give us a hint?
Not very welcoming.
Yeah.
I think, and I knew that Amherst, the town, was very divided. A family that lives near there, and said, there's this town gown divide, right, where you've got the townies, and then you have these college kids, these sort of, kids from Tony suburbs of Boston, which is where he's from, and so I knew that I really wanted them to be. I wanted them to be from these different classes, but I also wanted them to be to defy some of those expectations of that. And I think Ab, in many ways, is disappoints his father in so many ways, and bringing Ginny home is just one more way, and the dad calls her a distraction, basically.
Right.
Like, when are you going to get your real girlfriend, to bring her home, kind of thing. But I actually wrote, it's so funny I haven't reread this since it came out, and initially I had like 150 pages of backstory about their love story leading up to the moment, because I knew I needed to write it because I didn't want to demonize Ab. I think he's a good man. I think they truly love each other, and I needed to show how this could happen and how she could possibly forgive him. And so that backstory was all there, but then I pared it down. Actually, my editor wrote to me and said, love the book, it's great, but the pace is a little slow. And I was like, yeah, because I have 150 pages of backstory about these characters. And so over Mother's Day weekend, I literally spent like 3 10-hour days, like cutting and pasting, and I don't even know what's in there anymore. So like, there's this whole.
You can't remember what made the final cut.
I can't remember what made the final cut. Like, I was asking my, because like I said, I haven't sat down and read it. I have a hard time doing that. So I was asking my mom's cousin who had read it. I was like, did I put in that scene about the planetarium? She's like, no. I was like, oh, that was a good one too.
I remember that planetarium scene.
Yeah. So, yeah.
But yeah, and so the mom is this, I kind of picture her with smoking a cigarette, Anne Bancroft.
Anne Bancroft.
Yeah. And she's a woman of her era, and you also learn that she's dealing with the loss of a child, and how they, different generations are expected to deal with that.
But it's a universal for the. I mean, it's the one thing that she and Ginny can connect on eventually. I think motherhood is this sort of, like you said, it's this primal thing, and it's the one thing that this woman and she actually have a moment where they realize they're not so different from each other.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's also a road novel. Big. She goes on the run with Marsha is Marsha her friend? I'm trying to remember. Best friend, or I was thinking, was it her cousin? No, best friend.
Best friend.
And so she takes the kids, and and that's really interesting. These two young women with their children, no husband, no men with them on the road, going theoretically down to Florida. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, as soon as she took Lucy out of the institution, I knew she wouldn't be able to stay where she was, and so we had to get going. And Marsha is a nurse, and which is great to have somebody from the medical community along. But Marsha is this wonderful character who she came to me like fully formed, and she is everything that Ginny needs in the moment. She's the one.
She's a liberated woman.
She is.
Ginny's Camelot era.
Yeah, very, very much so. And they grew up together in Amherst, and from the same socioeconomic class, and they share a childhood together. And Marsha is the one who makes her do the things she needs to do. And by the end of the book, Ginny's doing those things on her own. But I think Marsha is, and I think it's like that with a lot of female friendships. There's everybody's got their Marsha, and she definitely. I don't think that Ginny would have done this without Marsha. Like, she needed an ally, somebody to just really be with her and pushing her. And she's also a little bit of comic relief in the book too, because it's a pretty heavy story. But Marsha provides some nice comic relief sometimes, and I love her. She's great.
So she knows how to get out of certain jams.
She does. She's very street smart, and
absolutely.
And she has a sister who is a mermaid at the Wiki Wachi Mermaid Show in Florida. And so if anybody's read my novel Two Rivers, there's a character named Brenda and her boyfriend Bruder who are in that book. And when I was writing this book, I was like, oh, they're going to be in Florida at the same time as Brenda and Bruder. So there's a little connection between.
Gives them a place to stay for a little while.
Yeah. And the Orange Grove actually plays a role in Two Rivers also. So.
Now, talk a little bit about what was your in to this particular story? I mean, was it kind of, you got the idea from the research and seeing this, about the facility and all the horrific abuses. How do you go as a writer from, wow, this is a great idea, I've got to write about this, this hospital and what happened there, to developing this particular story out of it?
It was through Ginny. And we were talking earlier, I felt like I had two jobs to do here. I wanted to tell the story of this institution and the child that survives this institution because of her mother. And then I also wanted to tell a story of a woman in this time period who has no agency. There's a scene in the beginning of the book when she's ironing her husband's shirts.
Yeah.
And saying, her friend Marsha asks, like, have you read the paper? And she's like, I don't read the paper. What can I do about anything? The only thing I can effectively change are getting the wrinkles out of the shirt and the grime out of the grout and the dirt off my kid. That's what her life had been distilled down to. And this is a woman who was working in a library at Amherst College and was just sucking up knowledge. I mean, she just, in another time, would have been
She wanted to be a poet.
Yeah. She wanted to be a writer, and just really wound up in a life, an expected sort of life, and a life where she had no agency. And so really Ginny was the end for me. And then I was like, okay, well, what happens when somebody, takes your kid away from you? That's like the most primal thing, right?
So if you did write a sequel to this book,
I've had so many people ask that. I'm like,
where would Ginny go in your mind? How would she develop? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I love that. I feel like she probably went back to school.
Yeah.
Definitely. Like, once Lucy and Peyton were, school age, and I could totally see her going back and getting her degree. And
Peyton seemed kind of like a little shit.
That's kind of a little shit.
Yeah. Is that bad to say that?
He was an only kid.
Yeah.
He was only child, and then all of a sudden, here's your sister.
He was mama's boy. But then there's that really poignant scene in the book where Lucy says his name, and it's like he's in. she's in with him. That's all.
Well, and when they're reciting the goodnight minute.
Yeah. Right.
And kids are proprietary about their parents, and I mean, he really becomes a brother, like this, and then we're not at home anymore, we're on the road.
Mm-hmm.
Who is this little girl? She's got lice, there's
right.
like all those horrible
Worms.
things that are happening. All these awful things happening. I forgive him.
Yeah. Well, kind of comparing this or as an extension of your last book, there are some similarities, really. The road story.
Mm-hmm. Atlantic City.
Atlantic City, right? Exactly. Now, remind me, Rust and Stardust, correct?
Yes.
Thanks. Yes. What a fantastic book! And you were here a year ago talking about that. We were talking about that. I want to say Julie Horner, but that's a customer of ours. Sorry, Julie. Sally Horner. The case. I just wanted to ask you a little bit. In that year, since that book came out, what's happened? Who have you talked to about the story and
about Sally?
Yeah, and about that case. Has much come out of the woodwork and?
No, not much has come out of the woodwork. I mean, Sarah Weinman had her book come out, and I think her paperback just came out, and she has an afterword that she wrote because she got a file or something from I don't know, with his like early arrest records and things from when he was very young, and I think that's really fascinating. There are always new information coming out, that I'm kind of glad I didn't know when I wrote the book, because I feel like that book now is its own thing. It's its own world. That Sally Horner is her own sort of thing, and I think for me the best thing that's happened over the last year is that I just feel like that book made my readership open up a little bit. I got more people reading my older books and reading this, and people who are like, oh, I'd never read you before, and this is number 13. So I'm like, there are a lot of books. If you like that one, you can go way back, 20 years worth of books that you can read. But I think Rust and Stardust was nice because it did get enough exposure that it sort of opened up the readership a little bit for me.
And getting back to the decision behind the tea, was that kind of a relaunching you in a different way?
No, it's been tea.
It's been from the very beginning?
Yeah, from the beginning.
Sorry, I didn't realize that.
Yep, from the beginning. And I always tell the story that, my name is Tammy. It's not a nickname or anything. So I really wanted to just be taken seriously. I was 29 when I sold my first book.
Wow.
And I just really wanted to be, taken seriously. But over the years, it's become much more sort of I've dug my heels in a few times when people have been like, why don't you use Tammy? And I'm like, no, you know what? Women in publishing are already fighting an uphill battle in terms of how they're presented, how their books are presented, cover art and all these things. And if you put a name that's very obviously feminine, people respond to it differently. And
have you noticed that that's changed in the years that you've been publishing? No, really?
No, I actually, this book jacket was the third, and I really fought for this one. The couple ideas that were presented were much more sort of women's fiction focused, like things that I don't know that a man would necessarily pick up, and
such as, that's interesting.
Yeah.
What kind of designs were they throwing your way?
They're backs of women.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see that a lot of books. I have books with backs of women, flowers, and I think it's really hard to see. And I saw this great article one time where they repackaged these men's books as if they'd been written by women, with cupcakes on the cover and things like that. And it was like, God,
Interesting.
yeah, it's really very interesting. I mean, sales departments know what they're doing, and they make these covers for a reason. It's because people are drawn to them. But I love the cover of Rust and Stardust so much. Cover. And this one looks
this is great.
This is the same designer, and I said, can we get her to to take a stab at it, and I'm like, put some oranges on there.
Yeah.
Going to Florida. And I mean, the other covers were lovely. They just were very obviously feminine.
It wasn't like a
yeah.
gothic look with an
No.
institution.
Oh my gosh. And that was the thing. I was like, wow, somebody picking this book up might be in for a surprise, because there's some dark stuff in this, in this book, and yeah.
What were some of the, not to gross people out here, but what were some of the really bad things that you discovered in the course of research?
Just the neglect. Overcrowding, human waste not being cleaned up. We were just telling the story of, these places just being hosed down because they're
Drains
living,
on the floor kind of a thing.
living in their own filth, and
Yeah.
being put in straitjackets to keep them from moving, and being restrained. And I think that skin hunger thing, to me, though, that is almost the worst. Just neglect, not being treated like humans or even animals.
Do you think that, we were talking about the just the public perception of the dehumanizing effect, but do you think that that was a place where kind of a predator could sneak in and flourish?
God, probably.
Yeah.
I'm sure there were abuses of all kinds, and that's addressed a little bit in the
Right.
in the book.
Right.
But I'm sure there were abuses taking place. But that's not to say that there weren't good people working in these institutions.
Sure.
And a lot of times I think they were understaffed, underfunded, and there were probably some very good people who were trying to do good things who just were not able to, because there were not the resources there. I like to think that there were decent people who went into this profession because they wanted to care for children like this, but were unable to because
Right.
of the lack of.
They probably carried that pain with them their whole lives, right?
No, I can't imagine.
On a lighter note, what do you have coming next? Any plans?
Well, there won't be a book next year because I actually wrote a whole book, but I've decided to wait on it for a little bit. And so I'm working on a new one now that is set in the world of pre-professional ballet, and it's about ballet moms.
Pre-professional ballet.
Ballet moms.
Whoa.
And much to my daughter's mortification.
Oh my gosh.
It's a little autobiographical.
A little heartwarming tale about anorexia and bulimia.
No, I think there might be some murder.
Murder even.
There might be some murder. I haven't decided yet.
Wow.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, it's such a
It's more of a book about parental ambition, which I think is kind of a timely subject, but set in this landscape of ballet, which I think is a world that people are interested in but don't necessarily know that much about. And it's I have a daughter who's a dancer, and so
she's a ballet dancer.
yeah. So
Fascinating.
we've been there.
Yeah.
And people keep saying, we can write about those ballet moms as soon as you are almost done, and then we don't have to deal with any, people
Oh,
thinking
gosh.
where I'm writing about them. I'm teasing. I have only the best friends that are ballet moms, but
Well, it's an intense world, I'm sure.
It is,
Very
it is.
super competitive and
it's very competitive, and I think that it is the same whether your kid is, in softball or, sports or, anything where parents become so heavily invested in their children's, talents and skills.
Megan Abbott's written a couple of books that deal with those kind of
Yeah,
themes.
the gymnastic
Yeah.
book. Yeah. No, that's a great book.
Yeah. Is
Oh
that
my gosh.
Dare Me? I'm trying to think about the
No, Dare Me's the cheerleader one.
yes.
um,
Right.
You Will Know My
You
Name.
will know.
You Will Know Me.
You
Yeah,
will know
that's
me.
a great book.
Yeah, what a
That's
great writer
book.
she is.
She is. She's one of my favorites.
Yeah. Anybody have questions? Or have I spoiled everything? Giving away all the
Oh, you haven't read it yet? No. Oh.
Nobody's read. Okay. Hope we didn't spoil too much.
No, I don't think
Let me
so.
see what else I got here. Anything else needs to be discussed? Got the men in control of women's bodies. Got the. I think I got everything here.
No questions?
No questions. Come on, Ira. PK?
The interesting thing is, that having experienced this, the Down syndrome is like the elite of the people who are in there are a lot more severely affected than the Down syndrome child.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever you have them doing to someone with Down syndrome, as I say, they're the crown jewels of the department because they can do things. I mean, there's just a movie on the Peanut Butter Falcon.
I need to see that.
And that's
Yeah.
a Down syndrome guy he's the star of the movie.
Wow.
So obviously someone like that could speak.
Right.
Well, I think
And
there's
say
so
what
much
you're
more
doing.
knowledge about these various syndromes than there was in the past. Spectrum disorders.
But it has changed a lot. I remember when I did a pediatric internship, and to this day, 50 or 60 years later, my most embarrassing moment was there was a black lady who was in labor, and they used forceps on the baby to extract the baby, and the baby looked like he had forceps put on him, and his deformed head, and I went in and gave her this little speech about it. In 2 days he'll look fine, and in 2 days he was a Down syndrome.
Oh, wow.
Which you couldn't tell. I mean, there are things other
Yeah.
physical
There
signs you
weren't,
can
there
tell.
weren't the same tests, prenatal tests, and
Right.
things that you can.
But it was tough on her because she got through 3 days after birth thinking she had a normal baby, and then boom.
I have a friend who's a physician, and she had to break the news to a mom because they're obviously varying degrees, and a lot of times when they're newborns, just from appearances you don't know, and she'd had no prenatal testing done, and she said, "Oh, this is going to be tough. This is going to be a
And to
hard
support
thing."
what you said about the bonding. My wife had a cesarean section. She had a ruptured placenta, so the baby was taken. We were in Colorado Springs. The baby was taken out of the delivery room, put on a helicopter,
Oh, wow.
and sent to Denver to Fitzsimmons. And they didn't think the baby was going to survive. And her doctor said, "You have to drive up to Denver so she can hold the baby." And that's what happened. She held the baby. The baby lived to be 10 days old. But at least she had
Yeah.
Yes.
a result of her pregnancy. If you never get to see a child.
Oh my gosh.
Well, and the baby felt that.
Yeah.
On a lighter note,
I know.
Tammy,
Heavy.
what is your day-to-day life as a writer? What does that look like? What's your writing habits look like, and coming up
Lately?
with the ideas and absolutely.
Lately, okay. So this ballet dancer of mine has graduated from high school, and she's training this year to be a professional. And so she's home a lot, and she's awesome, but she's home a lot. So we have a lot of conversations when I would normally be by myself. It's fine. I'm glad she's home. And but normally I get up early before either of my kids is awake, and I write in the morning, and then get them off to their various things that they're doing, school or whatever, and then I teach. So I teach a lot, and so I spend most of the middle of my day reading other people's work. I have a lot of students. I run 4 ongoing reading critique groups for novelists, and so I have about probably 20 students whose novels I'm helping them with, and I also do some freelance editing. So the middle of my day is usually spent either teaching or reading, and then I'm always thinking about the book. But I was joking because there was supposed to be a ballet competition this weekend, and my daughter has had an injury, so she wasn't able to come for it. And so I'm staying at the Valley Ho, and I was like, I'm going to get one more day, and I'm going to be in the hotel with no dogs, no kids, no job, no anything to have to do. So I'm planning to write my whole book tomorrow. I have big plans for the next 24 hours after I finish up with you guys.
Now, were you a ballet dancer?
I danced, but never to that level.
Yeah.
Never to that level.
Do you find that? What are you learning about the mothers and the daughters
Well, I just think it's really fascinating. I mean, we're all very close. I'm very, very close with the other mothers, and it's been especially interesting in the last couple of years because this is when our daughters are like making the decision if this is something they want to pursue forever, or if they're going to go to college, you know. And we made this, you know, decision as a family, and she made this decision as a you know, as an autonomous person that she is. But you know, when you've spent, she's been dancing since she was 3, so when you've spent, you know, 15 years in this world where she dances 6 days a week, you know, there's a huge sort of investment. You know, it feels like an investment emotionally, physically for her, financially. You know, there's so much that goes into it, and so it's such a strange time to, you know, for all of the moms that I know that are kind of like, now you just hold your breath and then you're sending your child out to, you know, be an artist in the world. And that also is really sort of an interesting thing and scary for some parents. You know, I think maybe because I'm an artist, my husband's in the arts, you know, it feels more natural and par for the course than for some other parents. But I've, you know, friends who are also like, oh my God, you know, are they going to be
It's
destitute?
it's a limited run, like, you know, many professional athletes, although
Right.
I'm assuming that's changing.
It is changing.
Yeah.
Dancers tend to have a much longer career now than they used to. You know, dancers will dance into their 30s, 40s. So, you know, but yeah, I mean, it's an interesting world, but I think, like I said, it's very universal. It's, you know, parenting and coming to the point where your children are making decisions and becoming adults. I think that's just such an interesting time of life, you know, regardless of what form that takes.
So what's your end for this particular story? Can you give us any kind of hint?
Oh my gosh. Well, it's told from the point of view right now, anyway. I'll know more tomorrow when I'm done. It's told from the point of view of 3 of the mothers and 1 of the daughters, and one of the moms has done something really bad. That's all I'll say.
Sounds great. Well, hey Tammy, thanks so much, you know, as always, for coming out. Congratulations on the publication of the book. It's really a tremendous novel. I hope everybody reads it. And thanks everybody online. Good night.